go ahead and open up your Bibles to Exodus chapter 15. We're going to be in Exodus 15:22. We're going to go all the way through chapter 17, verse 7. And so for some of us, that might feel like picking up in the middle of the story because we're back in Exodus, but we actually did go through the first 15 chapters of the story of Exodus previously. So if you want to have some homework, you can go to YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts or just ask Pastor James. He'll wrap it up for you. But the short recap is this: Israel, God's people, who he created to be his representatives and put in a promised land, had found themselves because of famine in Egypt many, many years before. And as time went on, as they grew in number, as the leadership of Egypt changed over the centuries, the Israelites, at being an ethnic minority in Egypt, now become enslaved and exploited to the point of genocide, where the Egyptians are killing the Israelite baby boys. God sees the wickedness of the rulers of Egypt, Pharaoh, and he judges Egypt. We learned all about it through these plagues of judgment that he brought on the Egyptian people, and he delivered Israel from this slavery. There's this great miracle where he actually takes them to the Red Sea, and you have the Egyptians on one side and you have the sea on the other side, and God parts the sea so that they can walk across on dry land. It's this beautiful picture of salvation, maybe the foundational picture of salvation in the Old Testament. And really the book of Exodus is about salvation. And so the people have passed through the waters of judgment. They are now free. They are a new nation, a new people. The Bible even describes them as God's firstborn son. What next? There's still a bunch of chapters left in Exodus. Why doesn't the story just end there? They won. They're singing with tambourines. They're dancing. They're praising God. Why doesn't our story end after our salvation? Why do we have to continue in this story? And in particular, why does the story look the way it does? What happens next is not how most of us would have written the story. They had made it through the difficult season. They had been miraculously rescued, but God still has lessons to teach them. Their salvation at the Red Sea has happened, but they have not yet made it to the promised land. They're in the middle. And I would say that life very much feels like being in the middle between our salvation and where God has us to be with him in heaven. In salvation, we're liberated, but the Bible describes us being disciples of Christ, where we are being transformed. You know, a lot of people have been through very traumatic experiences. All of us in some way or another have been through difficult experiences, challenging experiences. And the Israelites have been through one of the most traumatizing experiences. They've lived through genocide, they've lived through slavery, and now they're free. Now, we live in an interesting time because we have this tension of wanting to honor someone's trauma and difficulty, but we sometimes go so much that we define people by their trauma, right? If you've been divorced, you're now a divorcee, right? If you have been abused, that becomes the label that's put on you permanently. And so we have this tension, right, where we want to honor the difficult, the trauma, the victimization, but we also believe that God really can heal brokenness, that he really can transform our lives. And how does he do that? I mean, just imagine for a second, maybe a simpler example. Imagine a man who grows up in a household with parents who are particularly overbearing. Maybe you have been around parents like this. They're harsh with their words. They're unforgiving with their expectations. And so naturally, someone like that often develops anxiety and insecurity and perfectionism, never able to rest and celebrate the accomplishments that they have. And so maybe this man comes and understands the gospel, that he is fully accepted in Christ, that there's nothing he must do to earn God's love. Great. Does that mean on Wednesday of the following week, his insecurity is magically gone, his anxiety is forgotten, that he is never again going to struggle with the things that had shaped him? I hope so, but Probably not. Right? Imagine a woman who's been in abusive relationships where she has been used and neglected, and so she's developed this distrust of relationships on the one hand, and on the other, unhealthy behavior of seeking love she never received. And she comes to understand the gospel that Christ loves her, provides for her, and will never let her down. Does that mean that the negative behavior patterns and the unhealthy relationships that she developed magically evaporate? Not usually. See, it's one thing for God to get the people out of slavery. It's another for him to get the slavery out of the people. The first is this miraculous moment. The second is the process of our lives of following Jesus. And so we're going to see exactly how God does it. He does it in a way that is particularly interesting. He sends them into the wilderness. Look at Exodus 15. We're going to read verses 22 through 27 first. We're going to see this first scene. There's sort of three scenes that will take place across these chapters. It says in verse 22, it says, "Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' And he cried to the Lord. And the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, 'If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer.' Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water." They're still humming the worship songs from the Red Sea. The tambourines still haven't stopped playing. And Moses says, it's time to go. And where are we going? We're going into the wilderness, the desert. I can only imagine how perplexed the people of Israel might be. I certainly would be perplexed myself. But Moses knows that they have somewhere to be. God had promised to dwell with them, and he had told them ultimately that the promised land would be where they would dwell, but they would actually meet him on a mountain. And so they're actually journeying down the Red Sea through the wilderness into the desert where they will meet him at Mount Sinai. I imagine most of them would have been happy just to stay where they were. They just made it. We just got out of slavery. Why do we need to go anywhere? Much less, why do we need to go into the wilderness? Because the wilderness is where God is going to transform them into his people through much difficulty. 10 times in this section of Scripture, we see the word wilderness. The wilderness becomes the laboratory for their sanctification. It's where the truths of the gospel go from our heads to our hearts. It's the place where we are refined. It's a painful process, but it's necessary for our healing. You know, pain and healing often go hand in hand. We don't want them to go hand in hand, but if you need surgery, it hurts you to heal you. God is going to do surgery on his people, and it will hurt them, but ultimately it will heal them. Because the reality is, as much as I don't want it to be this way, as much as maybe it doesn't have to always be this way, most of us learn the hard way. Most of us learn the lessons that we need to learn, not in the comfort of an easy life, but in the difficulty of the wilderness. One writer says this: trust is rarely automatic, and God doesn't expect it to be. Rather, he patiently works on Israel's behalf until they see he is worthy of their confidence. God's guidance and protection of the Israelites cultivate their trust in him. The wilderness is his classroom. He has work to do in the Israelites that can only be done there. The problem is, this isn't what they expected to be. Right? Expectations are a killer. When I do premarital counseling, one of the primary things I talk about with couples that are going to be married are expectations, because that is really where the battle is fought. You're going to have difficulty, but you can at least control your expectations. You can't control the difficult things that are going to happen. But we often think that we are going to be immune from everyone else's experience. like you're in high school and they're like, college is going to be hard. You're going to have to study. You're like, people have to study, but me, like, I'm not going to have to study. Then you get to college, you're like, oh, they were like me too, right? Like, you're not exempt from that. Like, marriage is difficult. I tell people that, and they're like, not if you just like love the other person. I was like, okay, right. Yeah, you're going to need that too. But I promise you, it's going to be difficult. And so if you go in expecting it to be easy, you're going to be surprised when it's difficult. They expected following Jesus, following God, more here, Yahweh, right? They expected that to be easy, right? You saved us, you delivered us, give us the promised land, give us everything we need. When in reality, following a God is often following him into the wilderness. So here their problem is simple. They don't have any water. They're in the desert. They've traveled 3 days. And it's maybe even worse than that, because it's not that they don't actually have water. They actually have lots of water. It's just not drinkable, which might be even more frustrating. It's like being stranded at sea, surrounded by the ocean, but you can't drink it. It's like it's right there, and so you want it. It's this bitter water. And if you lived in my house and you were one of my children, you'd know that water is important. I think it basically solves every problem. Like, my kids are like, I have a headache, drink some water. Like, my arm's dislocated, have you had your water, right? Like, for me, that's like the solution to everything. And I can imagine being in the desert, this is like the only thing you can think of. Like, I need water. Where's my water? Give me some water. We're going to die. Give me water. And so they get to this water, and it's not even drinkable. They're surrounded by water, but it's not good. And it says here that God led them to this bitter water actually to test them, to teach them, to help them understand something about following him, that he actually can provide for them, that he actually can heal them, that he actually can lead them, that he's not going to take them somewhere that he can't care for them, even if they don't see it at first. And so you have this really interesting reversal of what happened. If you went back to the plagues of Egypt, we saw in the first plague against Egypt, the first judgment against Egypt, that Moses hit the water of the Nile, this bountiful river in Egypt, with his staff and turned it into blood so that the drinkable water of the Nile became undrinkable. Now you have the undrinkable water of the wilderness turned sweet by this log that is thrown in. It's this beautiful picture of no matter your circumstances, no matter how posh your circumstances, without God, they're death. But even in the wilderness, with God, it's life. That he can actually provide for them. That if you obey God and you learn to see that his way, even in the wilderness, is sweet, that his rules and his commands are actually life and not death. It's one of the things that I try to explain to people, that following God is not easier, but it's better. It is not more comfortable, but it is more joyful. That even in the wilderness of life, you can have a joy that surpasses anything anyone else has. And so I like to give the Israelites a hard time. I almost entitled the sermon Provision for Pouty People, because they just like have this knack for grumbling, right? I always joke that we know that they're Baptist because their spiritual gift is complaining. I say that as a Baptist, so like, right? I'm pointing that finger at me. But the reality is, we wouldn't do any better. Right? If you'd traveled 3 days into the desert with what few possessions you could gather on your back, with your family, what few animals you might have, you would pout too. And you would question God too. I mean, just like, let's take the seriousness of the situation for a moment. When we go back to the commands of God, it says that you need to have your belt on. You don't even have time for the bread to rise in your oven. When he says go, you go. No warning, you just go. So just imagine that there's a serious natural disaster coming. Your street's going to be flooded. You have 30 minutes, grab what you can grab and go. That's the situation they're in. They still shouldn't pout, but I think I would be in the same situation. And so God provides for them this beautiful picture that he can turn bitter things sweet, that he can provide even in the desert. And then immediately after that, notice what happens. It says they go just a little bit further, and they end up at the springs of Elim. Elim must have felt like a resort to them. 12 different springs, it says, 70 palm trees, which probably is just a poetic way of saying more than you can handle, because there's 12 tribes. Each tribe gets its own spring. 7 is this picture of completeness. 7 times 10 is overflowing completeness. Basically, they are at a spa compared. And I wonder if in that moment they're like, I should have trusted God. This happens to me. I worry, I fret, I get anxious, I try to scheme a way around things, and finally I give up and I'm like, okay, God, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to do it your way. And then he provides, and I'm like, why did I even waste the energy to worry? Because just beyond this place of testing, a test that they actually failed, by the way, God continues to provide for them. I think of Jesus' words in Matthew 7. He says, which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? It's this reminder that we have a good Father who loves us and gives us good gifts. We don't have to doubt him. We don't have to understand him, but we don't have to doubt him. We know that God is going to give us what we need, maybe not what we want. He's going to give it in his time, that his promises really are true. God's going to provide. He's going to heal. He's going to restore in his way, in his time. We have to learn to trust, but we live in the wilderness. We live between the Red Sea and Zion. We live in the promised land. We live between our salvation and our eternal home in heaven. We already have salvation, and we've not yet received fully what we long to have. Sin hasn't been fully abolished. This is the journey of the Christian life. It's walking into the promises God has already secured for us on the cross. So there's this provision in the wilderness. The second scene we're going to see is more of how he teaches them trust, this process of trust as he miraculously provides for them. Again, look at chapter 16, verse 1. It says, they set out from Elim, which must have been tough, by the way. 12 springs, 70 palm trees, why are we moving? They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Okay, dramatic much, but it's going to keep getting worse. They leave Elim and they end up in this new wilderness. They're no longer in the wilderness of Shur. They're in the wilderness of Sin, which James said I should title this sermon Wilderness of Sin. But this is not the English word sin. This is like the word Sinai. So maybe we should call it the wilderness of Sin. I don't know. But this is the wilderness where Sinai exists. They're getting close to where they're trying to get to. They didn't pass the first test at Shur, and they are not going to pass the test in this wilderness either. They are dramatic and forgetful. So they had been saved at the Red Sea. They journey 3 days. They already forgot God could provide. He provides there. They go another month, and they're like, there's no way God can provide for us again. These are my people, right? We forget, and we forget quickly that God can provide for us. My children's favorite question is, what are we having for lunch? Or breakfast, or dinner. Sometimes I think they worry that I'm not going to feed them. We've never not fed them. They always get fed, yet I think there's this fear that even though I fed you at lunch, I'm not going to feed you at dinner. We treat God the same way. You just provided for us at the Red Sea. You just provided for us at Marah. How come we forget right now? And I'm saying this to myself. I have watched God provide so many times in my life. I could spend the entire sermon telling you time after time after time of God providing for me. The time that he provided financially for our adoption. The time that he provided us a house to live in Philadelphia. The time that we thought a pandemic was going to take this church down, and he sent us an anonymous gift of $127,000. And I'm like, but God, where's my $5 coming from, right? Like we are so forgetful, and yet he's proven himself faithful over and over again. And they say, you've brought us into the wilderness to starve us to death. Do you really think God brought them all this way so they could starve to death? And the way they describe Egypt is this rosy picture. Psychologists would call this rosy retrospection or euphoric recall. We would call it romanticizing the past. They're selectively choosing to remember what Egypt was like. They were slaves. Their children were being murdered. And they're like, but the breadsticks were good. I mean, that's what they're remembering. But we were sitting around the meat pots. This is really what sin will do to you. This is beyond just a little hangry. Sin makes us stupid. Sin makes us think delusional thoughts that what was harmful was actually good. I see this in toxic relationships all the time. People get out of a terrible relationship and they look back and like, but it wasn't, we had some good times. See, sin makes us think what was harmful for us is actually good for us. That's why part of the beauty of the gospel is seeing sin for what it really is, which is destructive. The Israelites are quick to complain, quick to grumble, but they're grumbling against God that is particularly disappointing. Really, all grumbling is grumbling against the Lord because they're saying, you're not in control, or you don't love us, or you can't fix us. You have bad things for us. I'm quick to grumble. I forget God's past faithfulness. I focus on difficult circumstances. I mentioned God's provision financially for Redemption Heights during the pandemic. We were a brand new church. We had the goal of launching big in Easter of 2020. I don't know if y'all remember 2020. You probably sat behind a Zoom meeting with a mask on, wiping down your groceries. Who knows what you did? Because none of us knew what we were doing. Did I think God had brought our church to Philadelphia just to let us die? It felt like the wilderness. God has not brought you to where he's brought you just to let you die. God has not brought you where he's brought you not to see you make it to the promised land. He's provided. He's been full of grace. What if you and I let the past faithfulness of God shape our hope for the future more than our own fears and worries? Let me just read the rest of Exodus 16. I'm going to kind of run through this, so buckle up. This is the longest section. But it describes how the Lord provides for them. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, starting in verse 4, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day that I may test them. Here's that testing again. Whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, at evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the face of the wilderness, a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer, according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent." And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less, but when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat, and Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. Now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept through your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna for 40 years, till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Of course, we all wanted to know that. That's a lot. I know it's a lot, but it's an important section. And I'll try to summarize it as succinctly as I can. They have now come from the place where they have no water, so they get to a new place, and now what do they complain about? They have no food, right? There's a little bit of a God cannot win here. And so they grumble and they complain, and God sends them bread from heaven. Literally, it rains bread, carbs from the sky. This is like exactly what I want. And then at night, he sends quail, which is, I think Gordon Ramsay calls them posh chickens, right? So like fancy food. So you get like honeycombs in the morning, and you get posh chickens at night. What more could you want? But God is testing them. He's teaching them. Not only is he providing for them, but he's teaching them, and he tells them, look, you need to each day go collect this manna, which manna is just a Hebrew word for whatchamacallit. That's the best way you can translate it. They don't even know what to call it. So that's the Hebrew word for it. And I'm not even being joking. That's what it means. It's like, what is it, is what they're saying. And so they have to collect it for the day. But if they collect too much, what happens? It spoils. It goes bad. Anytime the Bible says stank, you know that's not good. So you only collect as much as you need for that day, except the night before the Sabbath, which is a day of rest, you collect twice as much. Pretty simple. But what do? They try to get more than they need. Or on the day when they're supposed to rest, they try to go collect again. They fail the test again. God is teaching them that he is to be depended on day after day. In the Lord's Prayer, what does Jesus teach us to pray? Give us our daily bread. Not our weekly, not our monthly, not our quarterly, meaning we are supposed to trust him today, for today. In fact, he tells us, don't even worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow has enough worries of its own. We're supposed to live in the present moment of his provision. In fact, it's good that this manna goes bad each day, because it's a reminder each day that we have to trust God. That you don't get to coast on God's past blessings, that God is calling you to trust him anew today and tomorrow and the next day You know, one of the saddest things I hear from professing Christians is when I ask them, what has God been doing in your life? And they say, well, in 1993, like, that's great. It's 2023. Let's update that story. Like, what is he teaching you today? How is he teaching you to trust him now? Not that the old ways are bad, but we don't live there. We're moving toward Zion. So God is testing them, teaching them to trust him each day. Now, when you hear the word test, maybe you think like a professor. He's testing them like a father. The way a father would test his children, trying to teach them how to live rightly in the world. The problem is, he's giving them the answers, they just don't like them. One writer says this, faced with life's problems, we say we have no answers. However, the Bible is full of answers. The only problem is they're not the answers we want. I often joke that when people come to me for pastoral counseling, that most of the time they don't want to hear my advice, they want to hear their advice out of my mouth. We go to God that way all the time. God, give me, and then we tell him what he should do. Because we know better. We know what would be perfect. God, if you would just let me win the lottery, everything would be fine. Because we know what we need. No, the truth is, he knows what we need, and we don't need our miracle, we need his miracle. Which his miracle might be in the wilderness. It might be just enough for today and just enough for tomorrow until you make it to the promised land. Because at the end of the day, God is not my servant, I am his servant. I am not living for my comfort, I'm living for his glory. So we have to trust him. There's an old song that we used to sing growing up. I think we sing it here sometimes too. A hymn. The words are, trust and obey. There is no other way. It's the truth. They have to trust that God knows what's best and is doing what's best, and then they have to obey him. Guess what? You don't just sit in your tent and the manna magically show up in your belly. You have to go collect it each day. Each day you have to trust God and you have to obey him. He said, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. When you trust him every day, you get to praise him every day too. Every time this church gives me a paycheck, I get to go, God provided again. How amazing is that? Every time you get up in the morning and take a breath, you get to praise God because he provided again. And this can be multiplied over and over and over again. And what a joy it is to get to praise God every day for his provision. But unfortunately, they did not listen to Moses. It reminds me of Jesus' words in John 6, describing this very event. He said, our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Jesus says, look, you want something greater than manna that'll last? I am the bread of heaven. And guess what the people did? Verse 41 of John 6 says, they grumbled about him because he said he is the bread that came down from heaven. See, too often we don't want what God has to offer. We want what we want. Trust is the prerequisite for salvation, but it's the pattern for our entire lives. God is calling us to trust him for salvation, but he's also calling us to trust him every day of our lives. Every relationship that we have, every circumstance we find ourselves in. And guess what? When you go through the wilderness of life, it is actually a gift from God to teach you to trust him. Every wilderness journey of my life, some I still feel like I'm in right now, are opportunities for me to trust that God will provide. I don't think you become a faithful person, a trusting person, unless you end up in the wilderness and you have to make the decision, God, I trust you. Unfortunately, the Israelites are struggling to learn their lesson. And so we see the last scene in chapter 17, starting in 17 verse 1. It says, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so. In the sight of the elders of Israel, he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? It's the same song and dance. The most consistent thing in this passage, besides the Lord's gracious provision, is the people's grumbling. God is patient. The old word we use for patience was long-suffering. And I feel like God is particularly long-suffering with the Israelites because they first were at Marah, and they had bitter water. Then now they're at Rephidim, and they have no water. At Marah, they grumbled, but here it says they grumble and they quarrel. The word quarrel here is a legal term. Right? You actually see it, right? Moses is standing before the people, and they are putting him on trial, accusing him. You've brought us out here to kill us, to kill our children, to kill our livestock. And Moses, you can sense his exasperation. What am I going to do with these people? They're going to stone me, God. And God says, look, verse 6, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. God stands between Moses and the people. God takes the stand on trial before the Israelites. He doesn't have to. He hasn't done anything wrong. He doesn't deserve it, but he does it. And what does 1 Corinthians 10 say? Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10, talking about this very passage, he says, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, talking about their deliverance from the Egyptians, and all ate the same spiritual food, the manna, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. What Paul is telling us, as we learn many centuries later, is that Christ is the rock that is struck to give us water. I don't know if you recognize just how significant that is. Moses takes this staff, the staff that was used to judge the Egyptians, the staff that was used to strike this rock, the staff that God used to punish sin. He strikes the rock, which is Christ, and water comes out of it. He's saying this, you and I, instead of receiving the just judgment of God for our complaining and our sin and our unbelief, Jesus takes that punishment on himself. And from him, he gives us living water. Paul says in Romans 5 this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's the gospel. That we are unbelieving, faithless, sinful, grumbling people. And we stand before God and we say, you are wrong. And rather than destroy us like we deserve, he takes that punishment on himself and he gives us life. He gives us water, water that will never run dry. Rather than getting the punishment we deserve, we get the life we don't deserve. That's the gospel. That Christ took our sin on himself so that we could receive his righteousness. And think back to Jesus' ministry. At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he is baptized. Like the Israelites walk through the Red Sea, they're baptized through the Red Sea. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. And then he immediately goes into the wilderness. And there he fasts and he is tempted by Satan. And rather than accuse God, rather than doubt the provision of his Father, he faithfully obeys. Where we fail to be righteous, Jesus is perfectly righteous. This is honestly one of the big impediments for people coming to Christ, because they still wonder, what must I do to be saved? And what you must do is trust in Jesus, who has done everything for you. He is the one who is obedient. He is the one who has taken your place. He is the one who's obeyed the Father. So it's through faith in him that we can be saved. And once you have been saved, then you can follow him into the wilderness with trust and obedience. Then you can walk with him without entitlement and grumbling, but patiently enduring. In fact, enjoying your time with God even in the wilderness. You can trust that he'll feed you in the desert because he led you through the sea. You can trust that he will care for your everyday problems because he gave his own life to save you. And so there's a warning here. And this, talking about this same passage in Psalm 95, the psalmist says this: "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness." See, life is full of difficult moments. And they can make you bitter, and they can harden you. But the Bible tells us not to harden our hearts when we go through the wilderness, but rather to respond with faith that God is taking us where he wants us to go. A pastor that I know once put it this way. He prayed this prayer: "God, give me thick skin and a soft heart. Make me tough and tender. Make me tough so I can handle life, and tender so I can love people." That's been my prayer in wilderness moments. God, in this wilderness moment, would you make me tough enough to handle it without my heart getting hard, while I still trust you? That I can see difficult moments as your opportunity to shape in me trust, that I would trust and obey.